When they found out that only half of the money that had been allocated to supply the Army had been spent, and then they began to see that the rest of that money might have been shared with even members of Washington's own cabinet, they called off the congressional investigation and exonerated Arthur St. Clair. So a lot of significant things happened because of this battle out here on the banks of the Wabash. Fortunately, that's not the end to our story, and the second half, as far as the Americans are concerned, has a much better ending. So we'll do the second half over here. Of course, that his back was against the wall at this point because other countries were vying for this Northwest Territory. Not only did he think the Northwest Territory was at stake, but perhaps even the United States of America was at stake. We always think of the United States as being such a strong country and a world power that it's hard to realize at one time that it was a very much a struggling country and its future was really very much in doubt. So he needed someone who could take over the Army, who would be a very strong leader. And so he considered a number of officers that he knew during the Revolutionary War. And the man that he tapped was General Anthony Wayne. Anthony Wayne was a very good leader, general during the Revolutionary War, and proved to be a very good choice to head the Army at this point. Anthony Wayne accepted the honor of being the head of the Army on the condition that he was allowed to be totally in charge. No co-generals helping him make decisions, which is one of the ideas that George Washington had considered. So when he took charge of the Army, he decided to model it after the old Roman legions. So it's the only time in our history of our country when our Army was actually an American legion. It was referred to as the Legion of the United States. Like the Roman legions, he divided his legion into 4 sub-legions, and he identified them by color. So if you just walk through the museum, you might not notice that these soldiers have different color trim on their hats. So we have representatives here of the red sub-legion, the yellow sub-legion, and the officer in the showcase in the back is from the white sub-legion. So we have all of the sub-legions except for the green sub-legion. And then it was considered a very advanced way of thinking and organizing. The fact that he decided that in each of those sub-legions there would be infantrymen, like this soldier who has the French Charlottesville musket, infantrymen, artillerymen, and dragoons, who were the heavily armed horsemen. He gave them each different shaped hats depending on what their job was with the sub-legion. So if you were in the infantry, you had a derby-style hat with a bear fur up over the top that shed the water in the rain. In the Revolutionary War, Anthony Wayne knew what it was like to have a felt hat that was completely soaked and the brim was hanging in your eyes as you were trying to fire your musket. So this was his solution to that problem. If you were in the artillery, you had a tri-corner hat, which obviously has the 3 corners that you see there. And if you were a dragoon, you had a leather helmet with a bear fur up over the top and also a tall plume. So that is the heavily armed horseman by the fireplace. And the idea of the plume was to make that soldier look even taller. So if he's sitting on the back of a tall horse and he's a reasonably tall man and he has a tall hat, he looks very intimidating. So when the dragoons would come forward on their horses, they would be a very intimidating sight. So just by looking at his soldiers' hats, Anthony Wayne could tell what sub-legion they were with and what their job was with that sub-legion. The infantrymen had the French Charlottesville muskets, and also they had the canteens where they could fill up with water at any point along the way. They had haversacks on their back where they carried personal supplies, and knapsacks where they carried the United States official supplies. Anthony Wayne was very much preoccupied, maybe that's not fair to use that word, but he considered it extremely important the way his soldiers looked and the way they dressed. And so he himself designed the uniforms that you see these soldiers have here. And they all had tailcoats These are their summer uniforms, and they have on the white linen breeches, as you see here. The buttons on the infantry and the buttons on the dragoons were made from pewter, and it had the flying frog, like eagle design buttons. The buttons on the artillery men's coats were made from brass. The infantry and the dragoons had a white linen clip on their long tail coats, and the artillerymen had a red felt flip on their coats. So it's hard to imagine that a general sitting at his desk designing the uniforms his men would wear, but he considered this all part of being an organized, impressive army. He also thought that the soldiers would be prouder, more confident, and so forth if they looked like soldiers. And so that was part of his preoccupation with having excellent uniforms for his soldiers. He also insisted that they be well trained, so he expected that his infantrymen would be able to get off 6 shots a minute with these muskets, which is hard to imagine that he would have time to load that gun and use the ramrod to ram the gun in there and get 6 shots off in every minute, but that was his expectation. He improved the process somewhat from the time that Arthur St. Clair's troops had come down here. He was able to amend, what's the word for amend? Drawing a blank. Anyways, he changed the gun so that they could do it with 1 priming instead of with 2. Used to be, he had to put powder in the pan and then also powder in the gun. But he was able to get it, that he was able to do it with 1 shot, or with 1 cartridge. So the ball would be loaded in here with the powder, and it would go down into the gun, and then they would have to use a ramrod to ram it down in there. When it was fired, the flint would hit the metal and cause a spark, and that's what would cause the gun to fire. Sometimes that powder was a little damp, and they didn't get a good spark. Instead, they would get a flash, and nothing happened. And that's where the expression "a flash in the pan" comes from. That it's something that looks good, but it doesn't amount to anything. In this particular case, this infantryman has been pressed into service to help the artillery. Now, the infantrymen often thought that the artillerymen were pretty hard-headed and maybe not so smart. It was also a very dangerous job, and they didn't like to be pressed into service to help the artillery, so you can see by the expression on his face that he's not happy about having to help these artillerymen. What they are doing in this particular exhibit is they are swabbing out the inside of this cannon. They would dip the rod with a rag on the end into the bucket of water, and they would swab out the inside of the cannon to put out any sparks that were in the cannon, because it would be dangerous to put another round out in there if there were still sparks remaining. The soldier in the back has a leather stocking over his finger that he would put over the top of the firing hole so that no air could go in and stir up the sparks, and so that gunpowder could not accidentally drop down into the cannon. And then after they had it swabbed out and they were sure it was safe, they would put in the next round to fire. What they are firing in this particular case is a hollow cannonball, and this hollow cannonball would be filled with powder with a fuse coming out, and there would be a powder charge put in this end as well, and that would be placed down in the cannon like this. And then this soldier would flip over his rod, and this becomes a ramrod, and he would ram that ball in down there into the cannon as far as he could using that ramrod. They would want that sack of powder back against the very cannon. After it was successfully loaded, the officer who would be standing in the back would tell these soldiers to stand back, and then there was a soldier in the back called a punky who would spread the powder around the firing and often use the tool he had hanging around his neck to break that sack of powder so that it would fire more easily. Then he would stand back, and the officer would give the order to fire. The soldier with a long metal rod with a cord wrapped around the end that was infused with gunpowder, that would be sparking, and when the officer gave the order to fire, he would reach across with that long metal rod, touch the gunpowder on the end of that, it created a big flash and caused the cannon to fire. So when this hollow ball would fire up into the air, it would go up like fireworks does, up into the air, and then of course when that burned down into the center, it would explode and cause flying shrapnel. And that shrapnel would fall on the Indians, and that was hugely dangerous because they didn't know how to fight infections at that time, and that dirty metal that was penetrating their body would cause an infection that often caused them to die. So they said that these soldiers got so good at this that they were able to judge the distance of the Indians and how far they wanted it to go, and that's what determined how far they would put that fuse down into the ball, how much of that was sticking out and how long it would take to burn. Now, another thing that they could fire from this was a canister of grape shot. So in the front of the showcase over here, we have various sizes of grape shot that was found here for recovery. And that grape shot would be put into a wooden canister, again with a powder charge. And when that was fired, that would come straight out and would burst apart, and it would be like 30 musket balls firing at one time. Now, in order to change the level of the cannons, when you fired this ball, it would go up into the air like fireworks. When you fired the canister, you wanted it to go straight ahead. So you see the piece of wood in the back that's shaped like a wedge, and that's what would change the level of the cannon so that it would fire accurately where they wanted it to go. They also said there was great recoil with these cannons, which is like kickback when you're shooting a shotgun or something, but instead of kicking back on your shoulder, these cannons would jump up in the air and sometimes flip completely over, so they were chained down to the ground or to the blockhouse from the hooks that you see here at the front and the back of the cannon. So you can see what a hugely dangerous job this is just from the artillery alone, because sometimes they would fire these and nothing would happen, and then you have what they call the dud, and who's going to go in there after that dud, and what are you going to do about it? Because about the time you're going in there, it's when it decides it catches a spark and off it goes, besides the fact that it will flip over and so forth. And then, of course, the fact that the Indians always picked off the artillerymen first made this the most dangerous job you could possibly have. So in the first battle with Arthur St. Clair, the soldier who observed the happenings on the field said that the bodies were stacked up around the cannons because there would be one round of firing, and first they would pick off the officers and then they would go off after the next artilleryman. And when one was shot, they would pull in an infantryman or a soldier from somewhere else, and it would be his job to help fire those cannons because that was the most effective firing tool that they had. So you can see why being an artilleryman was the least favorite job of any of the soldiers in the Army. The dragoons that made up a third of the sub-legions were the esteemed fighting forces at that time. It's like the Green Berets or the Navy SEALs today. They had the French or German rifles on their back. They had the sabers at their sides, and when they needed a force like that, the dragoons were called out. So they were considered the prestige fighting force. Wayne had a well-equipped army. He had the quartermaster was not a civilian like it was for Arthur St. Clair, but the quartermaster was part of the army, so he was able to keep control of that. He has soldiers who are well-dressed. He has equipment that works. The cannon, he said he wasn't dragging naval cannons down here like Arthur St. Clair had done, so he asked Secretary of War Knox to design a cannon especially for him. And it had to be a cannon that could be carried on the back of a pack horse, which meant it had to weigh less than 270 pounds. So the cannon that was designed for him, the howitzer that you see here, is a 260-pound cannon and could be carried on the back of a horse. The wheels would be carried on the back of another horse. They weren't pulled through the Northwest Territory, the Ohio country, on those wheels. The wheels were only put with the cannon when they got to wherever they were going, and then it was all put together, and then they could horse it into place And often they would have to move these cannons very quickly, and the order was just given for these guys to pick up the cannons and away they'd go. So there'd be like 5 or 6 men carrying the cannons to where they needed to be. In addition to having these supplies and organization, he was also a great disciplinarian. Arthur St. Clair had a lot of trouble with desertions, and so Anthony Wayne made it his rule that if you attempted desertion, or if you deserted, they would send soldiers after you, bring you back, and you would be shot. In the one case, 5 soldiers deserted at the same time. He sent his best Army regulars to bring them back, and he made one of his soldiers shoot the other 4 as punishment for their desertion. Needless to say, that cut down a lot on desertions that occurred in Anthony Wayne's army. So you can see where it's a very different situation comparing Arthur St. Clair and his situation to Anthony Wayne and that which he has at that time. Now, he agrees with Arthur St. Clair that the best way to protect this land and to assert American presence was to continue the building of the forts. So he followed that same system of forts up here through the Ohio country, went from Fort Washington to Fort Hamilton to Fort St. Clair to Fort Jefferson, and then he built a very large fort where Arthur St. Clair had cleared the land and was waiting for the supply train to come in, and he called that fort Fort Greenville. It was covered over 60 acres of ground and was large enough to house a town within it. And then on Christmas Day, 1793, he sent a detachment of soldiers up here to the banks of the Wabash River to build the fort. He said, I want you to build that fort on that land where that disastrous battle took place. And I want you to name that fort Fort Recovery, because we're going to recover the ground that was lost and the reputation of the army that was lost. So, previous to that time, the forts have been named after Revolutionary War generals, people that were important in the country at that time. However, when he came here, he called the fort Fort Recovery. According to historians, he was already playing psychological warfare by naming the fort Fort Recovery. He was sending a message to the Native Americans that the army was back and they were here to stay. So when the soldiers came up here to build the fort, they built this as a 4-sided fort, like the model that you see here. It had block houses on each of the 4 corners, 2-story block houses with a connecting stockade in between. Sometimes these are called palisades. In books they're referred to as fence or curtains or walls. So the block houses were built outside these walls of the fort so that from anywhere in the blockhouse they could protect this wall all the way down to the next blockhouse. Now, they don't know exactly where the Fort Recovery was built because those plans for the fort were sent back later on to Washington when it became the capital, Washington, D.C. And they were stored there, but in the War of 1812, when Washington was burned, the plans for our fort contributed to that fire. So there are no records of the fort as far as the design and the exact location and size is concerned. But they do know that it was large enough to house around 250 to 300 men, that it covered 1.5 to 2 acres of land. They do know that it had to have been approximately on the land out here that you see our partial reconstructed fort, because the well and the flagpole are both on the sites of the original flagpole and well. They did find that. However, they have not found the walls of the original fort. And they're there somewhere. You'd be able to see the difference in the soil if you were able to get to it. But because they rerouted the Wabash in the late 1800s, they moved a lot of ground and created a big embankment and so forth of sea. And so a lot of those things are probably buried pretty deep under the ground. So we're just fortunate that we know where the flagpole and the well were, so that we know approximately where the fort would have been located. Probably the east walls of the fort would have been around Main Street or Main Street. in town. And that's part of the negative part of our location here, because we tend to be a national battlefield when the town is built partially on the battlefield. In addition to build the blockhouses outside the fence of the fort, they also mounted the ground up like you see here to give them the added height advantage within the walls of the fort, so that the soldiers could stand like the soldier that you see here firing down upon the Indians as they were to attack the fort. Not that they ever thought they would. They also built a lookout on the top of one of the blockhouses, and there would be a sentry posted at all times in the lookout, just to make sure that they knew who was coming to the fort at different times. They also burned off all the grass, the tall grass and so forth, cleared the trees away from the fort so that they had total protection of the area around the fort. One of the really interesting aspects of the building of the fort was the second story of the blockhouse was built larger than the bottom story of the blockhouse. And the reason that was done was because the ports where they shot the guns from were very thick, because the trees were very thick. The guns were very long, the muskets. So they didn't have much maneuvering room with their guns in those ports. So if the Indians ever did attack, and they attacked in such numbers that they were able to get up against the walls of the fort without being shot, if they were able to get up even close to the fort, they couldn't shoot them from inside the fort with those muskets, because they couldn't maneuver them at that kind of an angle. So what they did to solve that problem was make the second story larger than the first story, and these forts were not nailed down, so that if the Indians did get up against the walls of the fort, they could lift up the boards and they could shoot straight down. So great engineering ideas even at that time. And as I said before, they made the fort as defensible as possible, but never in their wildest dreams did they think that the Indians would attack the fort, because Indians just did not attack forts. The way the Indians fought was like when they attacked General Harmer and his troops out in the open, when he caught Arthur St. Clair by surprise on the banks of the rivers, when they attacked supply trains that would be sent from one fort to another. That's the way the Indians fought, often in warring parties, but not in huge Indian armies. However, at the end of June in 1794, the fort's only 6 months old at that point, Anthony Wayne sent a wagon train, a supply train, to Fort Recovery from Fort Greenville. That supply train included 360 pack horses, carrying everything from sugar and flour to guns and bullets. And Anthony Wayne was very afraid that the Indians would attack his supply train and steal the supplies and maybe the horses as well. So he sent Major McMahon, a tall, red-headed Irishman, who was a dragoon and an officer in his army. And Major McMahon was the most promising soldier in his army and was destined to take over for Anthony Wayne at some point. So Major McMahon and his 50 dragoons accompanied the supply train from Fort Greenville to Fort Recovery without encountering any problem whatsoever. They got the supplies inside the fort, and then took the pack horses and the soldiers and headed a couple hundred yards back towards Greenville, on the road back towards Greenville. The fort just wasn't large enough for the additional 360 horses and the additional men, plus the supplies were already here, so as far as they were concerned, it was mission accomplished. However, early the next morning, the soldiers in the fort heard guns firing, and Captain Gibson, who was in charge of the fort, ordered one of the other officers to take some soldiers and to go help Major McMahon, because evidently the Indians are trying to steal his pack horses and are attacking his men. So when the officer and the soldiers get out there immediately, they see that it's not a warring party trying to steal horses. It's a whole Indian army who is attacking. And so they can do no more than just offer covering fire so that any of the soldiers who were still living could get back inside the fort. So probably 25 or so of the dragoons were able to get back to the fort, as well as the officer and most of his soldiers who had gone out to cover them in the process. And then they closed the gates to the fort, and then the real battle began, because the Indians came forward again under Little Turtle and Blue Jacket, and some reports say up to 2,500 warriors, Woodland Indians, Miamis, Shawnees, Delaware, Potawatomis, Wea, representatives of all of the woodland Indian nations of the surrounding areas had joined together in a great confederation and proceeded to attack the fort of Fort Recovery. The only time in American history when the Indians made a frontal attack on an American fort. The battle lasted for 2 days. It was 2 days of constant fighting. Again, that was totally out of character for the way Native Americans fought. They would swoop in, do their work, take care of the battle, and then they were gone. Arthur St. Clair's was a long battle. It was about 3 hours till it was over, but that was considered a long battle. This battle at Fort Recovery lasted for 2 days, and finally, Little Turtle pulled his Miami Indians out. He stopped them and said, "Never again will lead my people against the American army." He said to do so would be suicide to my people. Now, Blue Jacket did lead a contingent of Indians again against the American army, and that was at the Battle of Fallen Timbers, where Anthony Wayne himself and his soldiers completed the conflict with, or fought the Battle of Fallen Timbers against the Shawnee Indians. But I've read that battle lasted, in some places I've read where it was 20 minutes, and some places where it was 2 hours. So somewhere between 20 minutes and 2 hours that battle lasted. And the number of Native Americans and the number of soldiers involved was nothing like it was here at Fort Recovery. And historians, even today, write that it was really the Battle of Fort Recovery that broke the back of Indian resistance, broke up the Indian Confederacy, proved that we had a viable army, and proved that the Americans were in charge of the Northwest Territory. And ultimately, it proved that not only were they in charge of the Northwest Territory, but that the young country of the United States was going to survive. So it's hard to imagine that right here on this one spot of ground, 2 such significant battles could have taken place. And so many lives could have been lost over that period of time. The first battle, the number of Americans who died, and the second battle, the number of Native Americans who died. They say that when the Shawnees in particular, but also other Native Americans, when their warriors died, the way they marked their grave sites was to plant a white oak sapling. And so it's said that many of the great white oaks that grow in our area today mark the grave sites of warriors who died in the battles here at Fort Recovery. Next year, they had the signing of the Treaty of Greenville, and in the signing of the Treaty of Greenville, they established the Greenville Treaty Line, which comes right here through Fort Recovery, and the stake itself is back here in one of the showcases. At that battle, at that treaty, Little Turtle said, "Our losses at Fort Recovery were monumental." And they say just the fact that he mentioned that was an indication of how significant their losses must have been here at the Battle of Fort Recovery. Also, Little Turtle was the last to sign the Treaty of Greenville. He said, "I want to be the last to sign the treaty because I will be the last to break the treaty." And certainly that proved to be true. That pretty much tells the story of the significant battles here at Fort McGovern. What was that, about 2 hours?